Tonight, we head to Cornwall. November 1947. The war has ended, rationing continues, and a young curate discovers that some congregations never truly leave.
The Church of St. Ewan stood at the very edge of the cliff, quite literally. One more storm and it would tip into the sea. The Reverend Daniel Tressel was 26, fresh from theological college, with a copy of Common Worship and a suitcase full of optimism. He'd volunteered for the remote posting, thinking it would suit his contemplative nature. What the diocese hadn't mentioned was why it needed filling. He arrived in November rain, greeted by a single man in a sou'wester who handed him the keys without a word. The man's eyes never left the chapel, as if watching for something to emerge. "High tide comes at midnight," was all he said. "Best you're not here for it." Then he walked away, leaving Daniel alone with the wind and the sense that he'd arrived somewhere he wasn't entirely welcome. The chapel was Victorian Gothic, built when optimism still ran to remote places, cold and damp but structurally sound. The altar cloth was faded burgundy. The hymn board hadn't changed in months. Psalm 107, "They that go down to the sea in ships." There were no service sheets, no parish register since 1946. Just a leather notebook in the vestry marked sermons, Reverend Mathers in spidery handwriting. Daniel had heard about Mathers. He'd drowned last winter, they said. Storm surge took him right from the vestry. His body was never found. The sermon notes began normally enough, references to Augustine, quotes from the Psalms. Then, gradually, the handwriting changed, became more urgent.
November 3rd. The sea dreams. It is dreaming us. November 10th. No more bells after sunset. Something answers back. November 17th. Congregation silent today. I think they heard it too. Mrs. Trelawney won't meet my eyes. November 24th. Found salt crystals on the altar this morning. I did not put them there.
Daniel tried to dismiss it as the ravings of a lonely man. Isolation could do strange things to the mind. He'd studied that at seminary. He rang the bell for his first Sunday service, and it echoed hollow across the rocks. No one came, not for the first sermon, not for the second. But each morning he found small offerings left at the chapel door. Smooth pebbles arranged in careful patterns, shells still wet with seawater. Once a piece of rope that dripped constantly, though he could find no source for the water. On the third Sunday, someone was there. A man in the very last pew. Tall, wearing what looked like a fisherman's oilskin, though Daniel couldn't see his face clearly in the dim light. The man was soaked from the waist down, water pooling beneath the pew. He didn't speak during the hymns, which Daniel sang alone. Didn't respond to the prayers. Just sat, perfectly still, as if listening to something beyond Daniel's words. Daniel's voice faltered as he read the lesson. The man never blinked, not once in the entire service. After the blessing, Daniel tried to approach him, but the figure had vanished. Only a pool of seawater remained on the wooden seat, already seeping into the grain. The next week, there were two. Same silence, same unnatural stillness, same pools of salt water. The week after, there were three. Daniel began to dread Sundays. He asked the villagers about his congregation. "Who's attending the chapel these days?" The villagers exchanged glances. Old Mrs. Penryn spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. "No one goes to St. Ewan's, Reverend, not since the sea took it, and poor Mathers." "But people are coming," Daniel insisted. "I see them every Sunday." The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, a fisherman named Bodmin stepped forward. "The bell rings sometimes after dark. We keep our doors shut when it does. Some sounds aren't meant for the living." An old woman leaned closer, her breath smelling of salt and fear. "They come when the tide turns, Reverend, looking for someone to finish the service. Someone to speak the words that were left unsaid." "What words?" Daniel asked. But they'd already begun walking away. That night, Daniel found more entries in Mather's notebook. Entries that hadn't been there before, written in his own careful handwriting, though he had no memory of writing them. The congregation grows nightly. They remember the old words, the ones from before the Book of Common Prayer. Before English was spoken in these parts, they want to hear the service in their tongue. "I understand now. The sea never gives up its dead here. They wait. They attend. They expect to be ministered to. Tomorrow I will speak the words they need to hear, the words that will let them rest." Daniel dreamed that night of standing in the pulpit, preaching to a chapel packed beyond capacity. But his congregation wasn't breathing. Water dripped steadily from their clothes, forming rivulets that ran between the pews like reverse baptisms. In his dream, he looked down at his sermon notes. The pages were soaked through, the ink running, but somehow the words were still legible, only they weren't in English. They were in a language he didn't recognize but somehow understood. Celtic, pre-Christian, words of passage and release. When he woke, his pillow was damp with salt water, and he could taste the sea on his lips. In the notebook, a final entry had appeared. "It's not a sermon, it's a summoning, and they're almost ready for their final absolution." That Sunday, the chapel was full, every pew occupied by silent, dripping figures, fishermen in yellowed oilskins, women in torn wedding dresses from decades past, children in sailor suits that had long since rotted away, all of them watching Daniel with eyes like dark pools. Daniel climbed into the pulpit. His hands weren't shaking anymore. Something about seeing them all there, waiting so patiently, had calmed him. He began the service, but the words that came weren't from the prayer book. They were older, much older. Words of release for souls taken by the sea. Words of absolution for the drowned and forgotten. As he spoke, the wind outside grew to a roar. The ancient timbers of the chapel groaned like a ship in a storm. Water began seeping under the door, then through the walls themselves. His congregation didn't move. They belonged to this. They had been waiting so long for someone to speak the proper words, to give them the ritual send-off they'd been denied when the sea claimed them. The tide was coming in, higher than it had ever come, higher than it should have been able to reach. Water burst through the vestry door, the candles guttered out one by one. But Daniel continued reading, his voice carrying over the chaos. The words weren't his anymore. They belonged to something much older than Christianity, much older than this chapel. They were the words the sea itself wanted to hear. When the villagers came up the next morning, the chapel stood empty. The storm had passed without leaving its usual debris. The bell had fallen from its mount, but nothing else seemed damaged. The pews were bone dry. There was no sign of Daniel Tressel, but his sermon remained open on the lectern, the pages perfectly preserved despite the flood. The prayer book was open to a service that didn't exist in any official version, a service for the blessing of souls lost at sea. And in the final margin, written in Daniel's careful hand, were 5 words in English: "All souls safely delivered home."
Some churches lose their congregation, others simply serve a different flock, and sometimes that's exactly what's needed. The chapel at St. Ewan still stands, though no services are held there now. But on quiet nights, fishermen report that the bell tolls once at midnight, not in warning, but in thanks.